Perfect. I got the camera framed right on the first try. You have all been my unsuspecting guinea pigs, ladies and gentlemen. That's not actually true. I realized that after the fact, that it would have been amazing if I had planned this all out, but I didn't, because I released the free will video yesterday, and the comments explosion of inspiration in my brain regarding typology, and this is one of the classic little problems that I think typology can at least help to give some unconventional insight into. And I do apologize that this is another rant or ramble video, and I know that for some of you that's difficult to follow because we don't all think the same way. Some of you guys like it, some of you don't, but I needed to follow things in the spur of the moment so that I didn't lose it. So maybe in the future I will try to make a more formal video where I hammer things down more, but here I'm just speaking off the cuff because I wanted to try to lay out, I think, an essential difference between the axes. So let's just get to it. Because I've discussed or looked at arguments regarding free will, for and against, and I feel like I've seen certain patterns that make it, or are part of the reason why the discussion about free will becomes so difficult to resolve, is because I think this applies to a number of philosophical arguments, that ultimately they end up coming down to two different kinds of ways that people experience the world, and that are describable, I think, by the axes. So in the case of free will, generally speaking, and there's always exceptions, right? There's always exceptions because people can use their axes and can go in ways that are non-typical if they are creative enough or if they're pushed enough. But TEFI, I think, and by the way, IDR Labs has I don't think directly pointed any of this stuff out as regards free will, but have indirectly pointed it out in some of their articles. They've mentioned things. The main thing I'm thinking of is in one of the Function Axes articles, they mention the notion that they believe that FETI is more, I can't remember the precise term, but non-materialistic, whereas TEFI is the more materialistic one. And I think that's right. Like I said, generally speaking, it's more intuitive for TEFI to think, and maybe I shouldn't even say materialism because that puts a name to it. It most often, especially in the modern world, manifests itself as what we would call materialism. But it's not so much the tenet that everything is matter, so much as the psychological attitude that makes that make more sense. So let me explain. Because TEFI, and some of these points go for SENI too, because they're very similar in their structure, as I feel like I've been finding out. Because for TEFI, you have the external world. So reality, what is given, thinking and sensing, I think that's what they share in common. It has to do with what's given as reality is more concrete. So for TE, concrete reality is given external to the subject. So that those are, there's rules out there. But then the impetus to action, and therefore the center of desire, the center of ethics, of but more importantly, what drives you to do things, is introverted feeling. It's a part of you. It's internal. It's in here. And so, right, so you get that dynamic between the way that the world is and what you want to do. And so there's this reciprocity as the subject who has something already that they want to do is trying to figure out how to interact with the external world in order to accomplish things. Now, the reason this lends itself to materialism is because there's very much that almost sensual feeling of, there's more of a connection with the external world with TEFI in a weird way. with that function itself, and also with SENI in a sense, because you have that notion that I have something I'm trying to accomplish, and then I can change and mold the external world to reflect that and to be more amenable to me. And that's, I think, why you see in like Hegel and Marx and some of these philosophers who I agree with IDR Labs are INTJ, or at least NITE in the Gamma Quadra. Hegel and Marx, both of them, had this notion of trying to work out reality, working itself out so that humankind had this direct relation with their environment, so that what we will is what happens in the world. And I think that's a very classic Gamma kind of aspiration, where it's like you and the world become one. And so there's this real sense of reciprocity there because of the way that the functions are. Because if you see external reality as something that's external to you, but then you also have these internal desires that impose themselves, then there's always this tension and struggle between what you're trying to do in the external world, which resists you, and you're trying to figure out, how does it work? How does the external world work so I can accomplish? Now note this, that I think that because that introverted feeling, because the feelings are a part of you, in this axis, it's much easier. And so like one of the things in the comments that I think people were running up against, and that I've run up against, is there's the notion or the idea that we all experience an intuitive sense that we have free will. And I do still think that's true, but I think part of the problem, right, is that whenever you start referencing, let me set this up a little bit. Whenever you start referencing an internal experience of somebody, right, like they may not interpret your language and assign it to the experience that they're having. So it becomes very difficult, and it's almost like it's like a miracle that two people are able to actually communicate about their internal experiences. It's like you both have to have had the same experience and also have to buy into the same language that the other person uses to express that experience, and other factors too. Anyway, that's part of the problem here, is I do think that everybody experiences the same thing, but whether or not the people would describe that as people have the same sensation, but whether or not people will describe that sensation as this expression of free will is another matter. So like with FITE or TEFI, you have this, you already want something. And so when looking in the comments, it was like what you'd run up against is the sense of, well, let me describe FETI, and then I'll come back to that, because I think that'll make more sense. So FETI, in contrast to TEFI, FETI, the impetus is external to you. That's like the big difference. The impetus to action is not something that arises from within you. It's something that is external. Therefore, right, because you see it in other people. So you see other people suffering, and this is what pulls you outward to go and help them. And the problem is you trying to figure out how are you going to arbitrate between who you're going to go and help, right? And the thing is that FETI arbitrates that with internal reason. They say this is what makes most sense. In a certain way, they're saying this is what reality really is, and I've understood it internally. Here's what the rules are of how reality works, therefore this is the most rational thing for me to do in order to help alleviate the suffering. So it's a weird dynamic there. But the important thing is that the impetus is not internal. Therefore, I think that's when people describe this notion of the intuitive sense of free will, I think often what they're describing, or at least the way they describe it, is much more biased to that kind of experience, which I have, by the way, where that sets it up so it's much easier to describe things in terms of, well, I'm choosing and I have absolute choice because there is no wants and desires already in me. In fact, there's a rejection of me following any kinds of wants and desires of my own. I should pay entirely attention to other people's needs and desires and determine most rationally which ones I'm going to attend to, right? Because it does not necessarily mean that we're always running around trying to help everybody. INTPs understand that. It's much more about the principle, but there is still that sense of external suffering, which is why I do still think that Sam Harris, I agree with IDR Labs that he's an INFJ, or at least in the beta. In any case, I don't believe he's TEFI, because even though he goes against free will, his arguments regarding it, I feel like it's one of those exception cases where he's arguing a position that is technically not intuitive to his functions, which is fine. But because he's always talking, so many of his arguments have to do with, look at the suffering that's in the world, and this is attributable to religious beliefs, or it's attributable to belief in free will, for instance, and it's causing these people to suffer. Anyway, that's a hyper simplification. Anyway, you can look them up for yourself, and you should. Excuse me. But you get that notion, right? Because that's the important thing. So this is a common thing that happens, I've noticed, where you get people who are TEFI. In many cases, it's ENFPs and INFPs, mainly because, I've run into a lot of them who also will find NFJs to be friends with, right? Or something along those lines. And sometimes in a conversation, the NFP type, namely the FI type, will want to know what the NFJ or the FE-ish, TI-ish type feels about something. Like, you bring up a topic and you're like, well, the notion is, how do you feel about it? I'm trying to think of a good example. Like, how do you feel about Trump or something, right? Or how do you feel about Jordan Peterson? And maybe those aren't the best examples, but the notion is, it's like they want to know how the FE type is feeling. And the FE type, it's like, in my experience anyway, it's like there's a disconnect. It's like, even if I wanted to answer the question, it's like I can't. Because it's like, I know I want things, and I know I have desires, but when you pose the question that way, it's like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't desire anything. I don't feel anything about him. I can tell you what I think about him, but that's easier to do in a context, like of what you want me to, what kind of, you can pose a more logical question for me to answer, but it's like I can't reach down and find secret feelings beating in my chest that I can then bring out. Like, it's like they're literally not even there. And I do think, I've mentioned before the notion that FETI is much more likely to not have, it does not have that strong sense of self, because it's actively kind of trying to reject that. It doesn't have a sense of a feeling self. However, I do think that it has a sense of what I'll call a thinking self. Like Descartes, he says, I think, therefore I am, and will cling to that adamantly. And that's essentially that was one of the main driving forces behind my own free will video, because I feel that very strongly. It's that sense of, no, I do not have this internal wanting subject, because I've tried to purge myself of my own desires so that I can act according to reality, according to rationality, and a better word is according to what is ethically right. And what is ethically right must make sense, or it must be consistent. It must have this TI sense to it. And so, and because there's no internal impetus to action, you maintain that notion of free will, because the will is free, because you don't have any will applied to you to begin with, right? You start with none, or you're trying to get rid of that so that you can act according to reason. And it's infuriating or very frustrating when people are like, well, but you have a desire to follow your actions. Now, it's not infuriating because, it's infuriating because neither of these axes, I strongly believe, they're even, and neither one of them has a leg up on the other in terms of the conversation. Primarily because for FETI, from their perspective, it's like, I need to be able to choose. I need to be able to arbitrate. If it's just determined to begin with, then I don't exist, which was essentially what my argument was now that I think about it. Well, that's what I said very clearly, but I do think that's it. That for FETI, their internal experience is such that if you take away their rationality from them, if you take away their internal sense that I am a subject who's able to think, doubt, and then choose things, who's able to doubt his own feelings and change them to be in accord with what is good and true and right internally. If you take away that rationality from me, then I cease to exist, right? I think, therefore I am. You get rid of the think part, Descartes no longer is, as far as he's concerned. So it's like, but I am still here, therefore I can't not think, therefore you can't get me to go away. But for TEFI, it's the complete opposite. If you get rid of the feeling aspect, right, and in a certain sense, I think that's what the FETI free will argument is always trying to do, because they're always trying to assert, ultimately, that no, you can choose what your feelings are. For TEFI, it's like that leaves you just floating in a void for them, right? And in a sense, they cease to exist because they don't understand how anybody could possibly exist without motivations already being there. Which is a good argument, by the way. And just as a side note, I do have another video which was sort of like meant to be not a counter, but like two sides, because my one video was basically not strictly speaking an argument it is an argument in favor of free will, but I didn't phrase it that way. I was more just trying to say this, as far as I can tell, is what the situation is if you argue against free will. And you can do what you like with that. I had another video which is based off of an essay that I wrote in college, that is an argument against, not against free will, but against accountability and ultimately free will. It's an argument against that I wanted to pose because I desperately would like for it to be solved, because it bugs me. And by the way, one of the comments, Garrett, I'm so sorry, I'm trying to remember the first or the last name. I can post it at the bottom of this video unless you tell me not to, but one of your responses to my response to you, sorry, no one else will know what we're talking about here, but one of your responses actually was like a mini version. It turned into a mini version of what I'd written in that essay, and I was like, ah, he realized it too! And I kind of forgotten about that. I don't know. Anyway, so you can let me know what you think when I put that up. I know I'm not the only person to come up with it, but it's just the way that I formulated it. But it has to do with kind of that notion of like, where do our motivations come from? And like that essential problem that you have to be motivated by something, but the only way that you can choose a motivation is if you're still motivated by something. Well, where did that motivation come from, right? So it's this problem that FETI does run into, where if your subject is truly just a raw thinking subject, then why do you do anything at all? Because there's no impetus, unless you say that everybody has an impetus to, or that you at least have an impetus to rationality. But what about the people who don't have an impetus towards that? You could solve it by saying that everybody innately does have an impetus to go in the same direction, and that is a fact that we start from. And so, but that it's a question of whether or not you're doing what is necessary to get there. That's a train of thought you could follow that's interesting, that I think could help to satisfy both parties to some degree, probably more FETI, because it says, well, everybody's on the same everybody's on the same field because everybody does in the end want the same thing. It's just a question of whether or not you admit that, or you understand that, or you're doing what's necessary to get there. But set that aside. That's just sort of my brain doing things. Just to make sure, I just want to make sure that I've elaborated this enough, because I think it's very interesting and it could be very helpful to understand in this argument, is that notion. I'm going to say it over again. Fi, it's like that notion I was trying to talk about in my last Axis video, where I talked about the fair-minded versus the goal-oriented. And I am going to make another video where I try to hash out some more things about that, but I guess just as a teaser, Fi, like the reason that I do like the image, it's like a useful metaphor, I think, is what I ought to stress calling it. That notion of like some people going out into the wilderness versus people staying at home. I did relate that to evolution. I think in the next video I might reel back on that, because it may very well be true. I know I'd be very surprised if it didn't have a number of problems with it. I mean, IDR Labs already pointed out. Anyway, my point is simply that I don't really care if it's evolutionarily true. I just find the image to be very helpful for seeing it. And the image is that in the community, you have other people who have values who sort of press down on you, like it's this inward motion. The arrows go inward, like I showed in the video. And so you're sort of, that's the Fe, or the Ne, because Ne, the ideas are external to you. They're not part of you. You didn't come up with them. They're external to you, and you're just trying to orient yourself in terms of all these external ideas. And so that's why I relate it to this notion of the village. Village obviously relates it a bit better to FETI, because we associate FE with people, like putting moral obligations on you because, oh, this baby's crying, you need to go comfort it, or oh, this old lady doesn't have enough. But I do think that it can apply to NESI too, because there's that notion with NESI that there's other ideas out there that you need to attend to, and you need to be able to arbitrate between which ones you're going to follow, which is where the SI comes in, and that's why you get notions of tradition or routine sometimes, because that's how they decide they're going to arbitrate between these. And so you get that notion of a choosing subject, which is a necessary conception because you're choosing which of these ethical programs you're going to go with. And the choosing subject cannot have an impetus to begin with, because that takes away it being a choosing subject. Suddenly you're not there anymore. There's this feeling. That's a good way to put it. Because if the impetus is always seen as something external to you, then if you're fundamentally defined by an impetus, by a desire, right, then suddenly you're gone. Suddenly you become an other, right? I hope that makes sense. So for instance, let me say it again. If you always see desire or ethics, or impetus is my favorite word, because that means like a drive, a push forward to action. If your reasons for pushing forward to action are always seen as things that originate external to you, then for TEFI to argue that, well, you also have desires and drives that are innate and that you can't change, because it's logically impossible to do it. You're just desires. Desires are what's fundamental. For FETI, that amounts to, you're telling me that I'm an externality. The self disappears, right? Because desires are always an external thing. They're always an extroverted thing. But you're telling me that I fundamentally am that, meaning that there is no more room for TI anymore. There's only room for feeling, meaning that myself has been pushed out, because desires are always seen as something that come down upon you, right? And that's why you had that. I think that's why I'm biased towards that notion of the feelings are like they're like gusts of wind that flow through you, right? But there's still a you. There has to be a you because that's how I perceive it. And so the gusts of wind fly through, the feelings come upon you, and that's also why it's so hard when asked, well, how do you feel about that? It's like, are you asking how I feel about it, or are you asking what feelings I have in me, right? Because, like, my feelings just change depending, and in any case, like, it just feels not even wrong, but, like, incredibly shallow for me to just tell you how I'm feeling. Because it's not really what matters, because that's going to change tomorrow if I get different information, right? Or if something else happens. Like, my feelings change all the time. So it's like if you ask me how I feel about a controversial topic, it's like, well, odds are, I mean, if I told you honestly my feelings, it would probably be like great anger and frustration and, you know, like I hate everybody or something. Like very strong emotions or whatever, but it's like, yeah, but like those change, and I'm always kind of irritated with people in a weird way. Like, but at the same time not, and I need to explore that more, because I feel like I've seen that FETI, it's like, when you ask them how they're feeling, like honestly, it's like, well, most of the time I'm feeling kind of frustrated, because things aren't logical, but like, obviously I'm fine, and I do like people. In fact, I love people, but at the same time, it's like, when you frame the question in that way, it's like the only response, it's almost like the only response my body is able to give you is that, well, I'm just frankly very irritated and people are stupid, or, you know, like it's a weird response, and I need to think more about it. But, because I feel like I've seen that where, like you have Rousseau, like a classic example is you have Rousseau, who's like, people are at bottom genuinely good, which I actually rather like. But then you had, the lovely Marcus de Sade, who satirized Rousseau in a very ESTP, FETI way. And this is a classic argument that I think NFPs and STPs have, and other types too, but where the NFPs will essentially posit that everybody's feelings are valid, or if not valid, like you need to respect what other people have in them, and that's sort of that notion of NESI, like I'm looking at all the different possibilities around me. But also everybody has different feelings, and everybody should have equal opportunity to be able to express them. And of course, Sade comes in and he's like, great, then I'll be a sadomasochistic murderer and write the most awful books ever. Like in terms of, anyway. It's just absolutely, but it is a very vivid picture or depiction of, like, and I feel like FETI, it's like almost easier for them to just, especially beta types like INFJs, like it's much easier for them to just be like, okay, what's the most awful, horrible, graphic thing that I can imagine, like, doing to a person or somebody doing to somebody else? Like, in a weird way, it's not hard, I think, for beta types to actually imagine that, at least for the perceiving beta types, which is, I see that a lot with Jordan Peterson, where he emphasizes that notion that he's like, and that's what I mean by the, like, you ask me how I'm feeling, and I'm like, well, I feel irritated with people. It's not totally true, because I do really like people, but like you asked how I feel, and that's the only answer I can give. And I think that's the answer Jordan Peterson kind of gives in a weird way. Because he's like, if you watch yourself, then you'll see all the horrible things that you think about people or the things that you feel about people. And I think for beta types, that is absolutely true, because the feelings they just flow through you. They're not identified with you, per se. Or if they are, then it's like, well, I just need to not feel that anymore. And maybe that'll take time, and that's fine. But it's not truly me, because I am the deciding, thinking subject. But the feelings are just like, they come and go. And that might, and the interesting thing is that it's like the weird opposite of that is Freud, because Freud, the feelings are not external, the feelings are internal. And it's like this original sin kind of idea. And you see it in Augustine too, where it's like you start with feelings that are bad. Or Freud, it was more complicated, but like the notion of the id, where it's internal to you. And FETI can only accept that if it makes it so that the id is more external to them. Because the moment that you start saying you have these internal urges that are awful and horrible and you just want things and there's no reason for it, it's like, okay, yes, if it's like an external like part of my body but not part of my soul, and my soul needs to tame those and come to use them, right? It's like you're trying to externalize that impetus and then you can accept it. But for Freud, he's like, no, it's like that's a part of who you are. You have these feelings. And FETI is like, no, because if you have those desires, then you can't do anything else. You couldn't choose anything else. Anyway, I'm kind of spinning around, and hopefully this is helpful because I find it really interesting. And that, by the way, is another important point to make, that because this is an experience I've had so often, where, say, most often it's been STJs, very often ESTJs, but especially STJs in like religious contexts or even just ethical contexts. You know, it's always generally been like there's an older STJ who is relating stories about their childhood that are meant to convey messages of wisdom, right? And it's like, okay. But like the stories would always involve like the STJ or somebody else, but often the STJ themselves, because they're self-deprecating themselves because they think it's funny. Like, I really wanted something, right? Like, I just had to have that pair of shoes. So I went and I stole them. And no one could tell me not to go steal them. I just wouldn't listen. I'm like, no, I want the shoes. I will not listen to reason. I want the freaking shoes. I went and stole the shoes. I got arrested. Oh, I spent some night in prison and it was awful. I felt so bad. And like, it was really scary in there. And you know, and then I learned my darned lesson and I didn't go and steal shoes anymore. Like, I learned how to rein in that desire. Or not even rein in the desire. Like, that's sometimes just like, it's like I listen to that story and I'm like, I don't understand what you're what are you talking about? It's like, and the reason it's so frustrating is because I can tell that they assume that I have the same desires as them, like to steal things, or at least comparable things. Or more importantly, that I have desires like that at all, that I'm just going to follow without thinking about the reasons or doubting them, or that I would not take into account what other people say.